the foot of a towering mountain, countless dragon corpses lay strewn across the battlefield. Amidst the chaos, a lone man stood atop the massive body of a slain dragon, his sword buried deep in its skull, a testament to its demise. Though exhaustion weighed heavily upon him, he had single-handedly vanquished all the dragons in the area. A notification suddenly appeared, informing him that he had successfully cleared the dungeon known as the Ancient Dragon's Nest. The man appeared on the verge of collapse, but by gripping his sword tightly, he managed to steady himself. His body was covered in bruises, and his tattered clothes barely clung to him. Overcome with frustration, he let out a scream, questioning aloud why he was working so hard when he was nearly 60. That man was Shin Songyun, a 55-year-old swordsman, and the protagonist of this tale. As he reflected on his past, he muttered to himself that 3 decades had passed since he first became a swordsman. Yet his greatest accomplishment was merely securing a spot in his country's top 100. He lamented that such a ranking was meaningless in the grand scheme of things, as countless players worldwide were far stronger than him. Just then, something unusual caught his eye. A book floating in midair, surrounded by a pulsating blue energy. He wondered aloud if this was his reward and speculated whether it was a skill book. Resting his hand on his chin, he thought deeply, recalling that he had consumed artifacts before, and questioned whether he could do the same with this one. Before he could act, a bright light suddenly diverted his attention. As he turned toward the source, the system announced the arrival of a being known as the Constellation, late bloomer model student. A young man emerged from a portal, scholarly in appearance, with glasses perched on his nose and a book clutched in his right hand. He spoke in an otherworldly language, but the system translated his words, conveying that he sincerely blessed Shin Songyun for his efforts and praised his impeccable final strike. Observing the dramatic entrance, Shin Songyun muttered to himself that this was his contracted constellation. Despite his exhaustion, he managed a weary but grateful smile before acknowledging the young man and expressing his thanks. As if reassuring himself, he murmured that he was grateful to have been chosen, even though he was nothing more than a third-rate swordsman. Through the system, the constellation then revealed 2 conditions for reaching a higher level. First, upon reaching level 850, all artifact and title stats would double. Second, upon reaching level 900, all stats would triple. Shin Songyun's expression went blank as he processed the information. He stared at the constellation, who had slightly shrunk in size, and let out a bitter chuckle. The thought crossed his mind that reaching level 850 was nothing short of impossible, especially for someone who was already 55 years old. With a sigh, he admitted that, due to such absurd conditions, he had yet to benefit from his contract with the constellation. Breaking the silence, the constellation urged him to consume the skill book. Smirking faintly, Shin Songyun remarked that he had been about to do just that. Without hesitation, he activated his unique skill, Devour Artifacts, forming a glowing ball of energy in his palm. He noted to himself that this was the only skill he had obtained upon awakening. His mind drifted back to his early years, recalling how he had struggled to comprehend his ability. In desperation, he had attempted various methods, boiling, frying, even eating artifacts, but none had yielded any results. By the time he abandoned his futile experiments, 30 years had already slipped away. Eventually, he had discovered the correct method, utilizing mana synchronization with a sufficiently ranked artifact to activate Devour Artifacts. A regretful expression crossed his face as he acknowledged how late he had realized this truth. That was the difference between him and those who had grown stronger the moment they awakened. Returning his focus to the present, he examined the skill book. Yet, as nothing happened, frustration surged within him. Scowling, he threw the book to the ground, exclaiming that it should at least include some instructions. There was no way this could truly be a skill book. The constellation was so shocked by the hero's reaction that he hesitated before speaking. With a hint of regret, he explained that very little information was available about that particular skill. He then apologized for not being able to help. After a brief pause, he added that, Since there was still plenty of time, the hero should try again. Focus once more and restart mana synchronization. Hearing this, the hero gritted his teeth in frustration. Overcome with emotion, he let out an anguished scream, tears welling up in his eyes. He shouted that he didn't have much time left, that he was almost 60. If he had fathered a child at 30, that child would already be turning 30. If he had done so even earlier, he might have had grandchildren by now. He argued that the constellation wouldn't understand, as humans didn't live as long as celestial beings. Upon hearing those words, the constellation appeared confused but soon apologized sincerely, saying he hadn't meant to offend. The hero, now sitting on the ground with a weary and defeated expression, let out a sigh. He assured the constellation that he hadn't done anything wrong. It was simply that his life had been filled with regrets. As he gazed into the distance, lost in thought, he admitted that he had never been able to forget a certain figure from his past. He had tried his best to become like that person, but in the end, he had only exhausted himself. With a regretful look, he murmured that he was too old, if only he had been a little younger. At these words, the constellation merely smiled. The hero, scratching his head, let out a dry chuckle before informing the constellation that he was retiring. Since he was canceling their contract, he advised him to find another player. No sooner had he spoken than a surge of purple energy erupted around him. Before he could react, he realized that the source was none other than the constellation. A strange skill had been activated, pulling him into a bizarre portal. He could feel his body dissolving, melting away into the swirling void. And just like that, the last memory of Shin Songyun as a 55-year-old faded into darkness. Suddenly, a system screen appeared. The constellation Late Bloomer Model Student has utilized the essence you have experimented with, triggering the activation of the unique ability, Regression. Meanwhile, a televised interview was airing. The reporter, Park Jong-min, turned to the person seated beside him and inquired if dungeons and gates were essentially the environments where awakened individuals, commonly referred to as players, carried out their work. The woman beside him, Han Hyun-jong, CEO of a major corporation, responded with a faint smile. She confirmed that this was correct, explaining that dungeons acted as stepping stones for players, while gates served as portals to unknown dimensions, places that players were tasked with exploring and pioneering. Elsewhere, in a modest apartment, a black-haired man leaned back in his chair, watching the interview with an amused smirk. That man was Shin Songyun, who had regressed to the past. Still gripping a dagger, he muttered to himself that his regression was real. A nostalgic smile played on his lips as he remarked that it had been a long time since he had last watched that broadcast. With a puzzled expression, he tried to process his situation, realizing that 4 days had already passed. More importantly, he understood that he had traveled back exactly 30 years. Reflecting on the past few days, he recalled that, after losing consciousness, he had awakened in his old studio apartment, the very same one from 30 years ago. What shocked him the most, however, was not just the time leap itself. It was the fact that he was no longer in his 55-year-old body. Instead, he had returned to his 25-year-old self, with all his memories fully intact. No matter how much he thought about it, he could only conclude that the constellation's miracle was the cause. Spinning his dagger in the air, he let out a small laugh. Though still confused, he decided not to dwell on it. Instead, he mused about whether he should head out to work. Just then, a system panel appeared, displaying information about his weapon. Name: Venomoth's Dagger. Bronze Artifact. Weapon type: Dagger. Attack power: +17. Effect: Agility +17. Description: a self-defense dagger. Does not become blunt easily. Gripping the weapon tightly, he murmured to himself that this was the bronze-tier dagger he had been lucky to acquire at this point in time. Though its rank was low, he knew about its hidden skill. Without hesitation, he activated his Devour skill and directed it at the dagger. Immediately, another system notification appeared, determining absorption rate. The base absorption rate for a bronze-tier artifact is 10%. Due to prior usage of the artifact, the final absorption rate has been adjusted to 20%. With an excited expression and a faint glow emanating from his hand, the hero smiled. Although the absorption rate was low due to his limited use of the weapon, what truly mattered to him was its hidden skill. At that moment, a notification appeared before him, informing him that mana synchronization with Venomoth's dagger had begun. As soon as the message manifested, his consciousness slipped away, pulling him into the gap of unconsciousness. Inside this dimension, his soul mirrored his physical body, except for one striking difference. His hair, which was black in the real world, had turned white here. Looking around with excitement, he acknowledged to himself that this was the space he needed to bypass in order to absorb an artifact. He admitted that he always felt nervous whenever he entered, uncertain of what kind of dish would appear. As if in response to his thoughts, a plate materialized before him, carrying a roasted chicken drizzled with olive oil. Letting out a sigh of relief, he reassured himself that it was just a normal dish, unlike the bizarre alternatives he had feared, such as humid swamp centipede. He picked up a chicken leg, took a bite, and nodded in satisfaction, thinking that if it were always something this pleasant, he wouldn't mind at all. Then, another notification appeared, informing him that the absorption of Venomoth's dagger had begun. Moments later, another message followed, confirming that he had permanently acquired the stat agility +2. A panel then materialized, displaying an image of a skill and announcing that he had obtained the hidden skill, Demon Bash. As his dagger disintegrated piece by piece, a final notification surfaced, stating that Venomoth's dagger had been completely absorbed and would now disappear forever. Upon returning to reality, the hero exhaled deeply, acknowledging that it was a shame the weapon had been destroyed. However, he reassured himself that he hadn't planned on using it much anyway. Feeling satisfied, he stretched and smirked, pleased that he had acquired the skill he wanted. With that, he decided it was time to move forward. At the entrance of dungeon number 85, a massive gate loomed before a gathering of players preparing for the upcoming raid. They were busy making last-minute preparations and organizing materials. In the midst of the commotion, a man came running toward the hunter team leader, his voice urgent as he called out for Yoon Daekyung. Hearing his name, Yoon Daekyung, who had been in the middle of his work, turned his head. His expression remained neutral as he inquired about the reason for the Porter team leader's sudden approach. Scratching his head nervously, the Porter team leader hesitated before explaining that one of his team members had backed out. He mentioned that the member in question was a newcomer who had only joined 4 days ago, a man named Shin Songyun. At the mention of the name, Yoon Daekyung clenched his fist slightly before assuring the Porter team leader that he need not worry about Shin Songyun, as it had already been decided that he would join the player team instead. Hearing this, the Porter team leader furrowed his brows in confusion and questioned whether he had heard correctly. Was Shin Songyun really joining the player team and not the Porter team? Remaining calm, Yoon Daekyung confirmed that he had personally approved the decision and then asked if there was a problem. Panic spread across the Porter team leader's face as he protested, arguing that Shin Songyun had only recently awakened and hadn't even completed the player academy yet. He pointed out that assigning someone so inexperienced to the player team was unprecedented and would throw off the balance. He also expressed concerns about how he was supposed to manage the team's workload under these conditions. Before he could finish his sentence, Yoon Daekyung took a step closer. His imposing presence towered over the smaller man, exuding an oppressive aura. With a cold, menacing smile, Yoon Daekyung reminded him that he personally handled everything: the party, the contribution system, and the distribution of rewards. Feeling the tension rise, the Porter team leader swallowed hard, his voice faltering as he quickly apologized. Once the Porter team leader left, Yoon Daekyung scoffed and turned to his subordinate, remarking that allowing those Porter rats to talk too much would only lead them to believe they had a say in things, something he considered a waste of time. A blonde-haired hunter standing nearby crossed his arms and admitted that he, too, found the decision unexpected. He then asked why Yoon Daekyung had accepted Shin Songyun into the team. With a smirk, Yoon Daekyung responded proudly, explaining that if someone was going to die, it would be Shin Songyun, not them. A sinister glint flashed in his eyes as he continued, suggesting that every now and then, a few porters needed to act up and die. That way, the others would remain silent, ensuring that their value as players stayed intact. His lips curled into a twisted grin as he finalized his thoughts. As the conversation continued, Shin Songyun approached the group with confidence, a long sword strapped to his back. Stopping before them, he introduced himself clearly, stating that he would be working as a player from that day forward, and that his name was Shin Songyun. At that moment, the porter team members turned to him with anger, while the player team members regarded him with sinister amusement. Feeling the weight of their cold gazes, Shin Songyun remained expressionless, though inwardly, he couldn't help but reflect on their reactions. He noted how expressive they all were, something he had expected, but he thought they were taking it too far by not even attempting to hide their hostility. Just then, Yoon Daekyung, the leader of the player team, approached with a broad grin, exclaiming that their newcomer had finally arrived. Addressing him by name, he welcomed him and remarked that he had expected Shin Songyun to be late on his first day as a player. As he spoke, Yoon Daekyung's gaze drifted to the long sword strapped to Shin Songyun's back. His grin widened into a sarcastic smirk as he pointed at the weapon, questioning whether it was really a long sword. In response, Shin Songyun scratched his head and admitted that he had studied a lot of videos on YouTube. Hearing this, Yoon Daekyung crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow, noting that a long sword was one of the most difficult types of weapons to wield. Clenching his fists, Shin Songyun responded with an eager expression, his eyes shining with determination as he declared that, at the very least, he wanted to be able to protect himself. He then asked Yoon Daekyung to trust him. Upon hearing those words, Yoon Daekyung suddenly burst into laughter. Then, throwing an arm around Shin Songyun's neck in a mock-friendly gesture, he chuckled, expressing his approval of the newcomer's spirit and claiming that men needed to have spirit, just as he did. Raising his arm, he turned toward his team and loudly declared that it was time to start the dungeon raid, urging them all to go wild. As the players entered the dungeon gate, Yoon Daekyung gave them instructions, telling them to stay on standby at the entrance once inside. While walking toward the gate, one player smirked and nudged his companion, wondering aloud how many enemies he would kill that day. His companion scoffed and replied that he wasn't sure about that, but he knew for certain that he would kill more. Meanwhile, as Shin Songyun walked past Yoon Daekyung, the team leader's gaze darkened, lingering on him. Muttering under his breath, Yoon Daekyung sneered at the idea of Shin Songyun learning from YouTube videos, finding it utterly ridiculous. He questioned whether the newcomer truly believed dungeons were just a walk in the park. His lips curled in disdain as he thought about how arrogant Shin Songyun had become just because he had awakened and become a player. In Yoon Daekyung's mind, it was clear that the newcomer had a death wish. Recalling the raid strategy he had put together, he reassured himself that the orc dungeon was infamous for being the wailing wall for newbies. A sinister gleam flickered in his eyes as he convinced himself that Shin Songyun would learn his place soon enough. He regarded him as nothing more than a stupid fool, destined to fail. However, reality turned out to be far different from what Yoon Daekyung had expected. Standing frozen in place, his face had gone pale as he stared in disbelief at the scene before him. What he had just witnessed was beyond his imagination. Shin Songyun effortlessly slaughtering orcs with ease. His plan had completely fallen apart. However, all of that happened just an hour ago. Inside the dungeon, orcs were among the most common monsters, creatures frequently depicted in games, novels, and movies set in fantasy worlds. Because they were so familiar, people had developed prejudices against them. Many believed that orcs were weak. And compared to monsters like dragons, they certainly seemed brutish, stupid, and violent. Due to this perception, new players often rushed into battle against them without much thought. Just like the man who now charged forward, swinging his sword at an orc. Unfortunately for him, the orc effortlessly caught his head in one massive hand. On average, Orcs stood at 250 centimeters and weighed around 180 kilograms. Their sheer physical power created an insurmountable gap between them and humans. The man struggled in the monster's grip, screaming for it to let him go, but the orc only tightened its hold. Then, with a sickening crunch, it crushed his skull, sending blood splattering in all directions. This was why orcs had earned the grim nickname, the Wall of Lament. Meanwhile, deeper inside the dungeon, Shin Songyun continued his journey, following the team leader who led the expedition into the dungeon. One of the team members suddenly turned toward him with a scowl and warned him that being a newbie wouldn't earn him any special treatment. He was on his own. Even the leader of the porter team, watching from the sidelines, scoffed at his presence, remarking that he was acting like a player just because he had awakened, calling him an arrogant loser. Scratching his head with a smirk, Shin Songyun responded with a sarcastic remark, assuring them he would try his hardest. Then, muttering under his breath, he noted to himself that no one was ever nice to newcomers. His response only irritated the man further. With a furious expression, he barked at him, telling him not to simply try his best but to actually perform well. Meeting his gaze calmly, Shin Songyun inquired whether he would be permitted to fight on the front lines if he encountered a monster. The man scoffed at the suggestion, questioning whether he had lost his mind. Before he could say more, his face suddenly paled, as if he had just seen a ghost. Moments later, he cried out in alarm. It was an orc. While the rest of the team reacted with panic, Shin Songyun's eyes gleamed with excitement. Having regressed, this would be his first real battle since returning. Gripping his greatsword tightly, he stepped forward and confidently declared that he would handle the fight. However, before he could make his move, a black-haired team member raised his shield and rushed in to engage the orc instead. As the monster swung its massive fist, the man blocked the blow, gritting his teeth. Turning toward Shin Songyun, he yelled at him, questioning whether he was insane. He demanded to know how he planned to fight with a greatsword when his movements were so slow. Shin Songyun, however, remained composed and simply pointed out that he hadn't needed assistance. Hearing those words, the man faltered for a moment, his expression darkening in frustration as he ordered him to stop talking and prove his skill. With a casual shrug, Shin Songyun agreed but advised him to look ahead. The moment the man turned his head back, his eyes widened in horror. An orc's massive axe was already descending toward him. There was no time to dodge. Just as he braced for death, a sudden force collided with the orc. Yoon Daekyung, the team leader, had charged in, slamming his shield into the monster's head with immense force. The impact sent the orc crashing to the ground with a loud boom. Furious, Yoon Daekyung turned on his teammates, demanding to know whether they were on a picnic and ordering them to focus. The black-haired man stiffened, quickly apologizing to his leader. Meanwhile, a blonde-haired teammate expressed his amazement, calling Yoon Daekyung's display incredible. Before they could relax, however, the orc let out a low growl and began to rise again. Its beady eyes locked onto Yoon Daekyung, who immediately ordered the others to stay back, declaring that he would take care of the monster himself. With a deafening roar, the orc swung its axe. Yoon Daekyung blocked the strike with his shield before thrusting his sword forward, piercing the monster's chest. Seeing the blood pour from the wound, the team cheered, praising their leader's strength. The blonde-haired teammate, observing the attack, asked if the orc was dead, since its heart had been pierced. Before anyone could answer, the orc suddenly twitched. Raising its axe once more, it lunged at Yoon Daekyung. Caught off guard, the team leader barely managed to dodge in time, exclaiming in shock that the attack hadn't been enough to kill it. Watching from the sidelines, Shin Songyun observed the fight with a thoughtful expression. Yoon Daekyung was supposed to be the strongest one among them, yet he was only level 50. Narrowing his eyes, Shin Songyun realized that the team leader was incapable of landing a critical hit on the monster. At that moment, Yoon Daekyung rushed toward the orc with a furious expression and drove his sword into its chest with a powerful strike. As he delivered the final blow, he shouted for the creature to die. The orc collapsed lifelessly onto the ground, and his team members, stunned, exclaimed in disbelief that he had managed to take it down on his own. Turning to face them with a proud look, Yoon Daekyung dismissed their praise, insisting it was nothing before asking if they were all unharmed. His teammates, wearing triumphant smiles, assured him that they were fine. One of them, filled with admiration, remarked on how dependable he was. Just as Yoon Daekyung was about to instruct them to prepare to move out, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the dungeon. The entire team froze. When he turned his head toward the source of the sound, they all widened their eyes in horror at the sight of a group of red-skinned orcs approaching. The blonde-haired teammate gasped, his voice shaking as he identified the creatures as high orcs. Another man, his face going pale, cried out in alarm upon noticing armored orcs among them. Frantically, he turned to Yoon Daekyung and demanded to know what their next course of action should be. Yoon Daekyung quickly assessed the situation, his expression darkening as he decided that they should retreat for the safety of the team. Under his breath, however, he muttered in frustration, realizing that if a single regular orc had been difficult to handle, these stronger opponents would be on an entirely different level. Just then, Shin Songyun stepped forward, his face calm as he asked if he could give it a try. Everyone turned to him in shock. One of the players shouted in disbelief, demanding to know if he was serious. Another, his voice filled with anger, questioned whether he had lost his mind. A member of the player team, who had been overseeing Shin Songyun, immediately bowed his head apologetically toward Yoon Daekyung, admitting that he should have trained him better. Yoon Daekyung, attempting to reason with him, warned that he understood his excitement over awakening, but before he could finish, Shin Songyun suddenly dashed forward at an incredible speed, gripping his long sword tightly. Cursing, Yoon Daekyung shouted after him, warning that he was going to get himself killed. But Shin Songyun ignored the warning completely. In one swift motion, he swung his long sword at the nearest orc, the blade cleaving through flesh and bone and splitting the massive creature cleanly in two. The upper half of the orc's body slid off, crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. As he observed the fallen corpse, Shin Songyun casually remarked that a greatsword was quite effective, noting how clean the cut had been. His teammates stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. The blonde-haired player, sweat dripping down his face, stammered in disbelief, questioning what had just happened. Beside him, another player muttered with a trembling voice, astounded that a high orc had been split in half, despite the weapon being a long sword. Shin Songyun rested his sword on his shoulder, a slight smile on his lips, and mused aloud whether it was because he was still level 1, commenting that the slice hadn't felt as clean as he knew it could be. Just then, a translucent screen appeared before him, displaying his stats. Name: Shin Songyun. Level 1. Title: Empty. Constellation: Empty. Exclusive skill: Devour Artifacts. Consumed Artifacts: 1. HP: 200. MP: 20. EXP: 40. Meanwhile, the remaining high orcs, seething with rage over their fallen comrade, let out furious roars before charging at Shin Songyun, eager to avenge their companion. Despite the overwhelming threat, he remained completely composed. Tightening his grip on his long sword, he prepared himself for the next attack. As the orcs closed in, he smirked, muttering to himself that, while his level might be low, he had plenty of experience to make up for it. The moment he was within range, he lunged forward with astonishing speed. His blade sliced cleanly through 2 more orcs, cutting them in half before they had a chance to react. The third orc let out an enraged roar and raised its massive weapon high, aiming to crush him into the ground. However, Shin Songyun dodged effortlessly, shifting his body slightly to the left. Then, with a fierce glint in his eyes, he swung his long sword once more. In an instant, the orc's arms and head were severed from its body as its lifeless form crumpled to the ground. Shin Songyun scoffed, wondering aloud if the creatures had any idea how many of them he had slain before. The members of the player team who had been watching the fight were utterly shocked. The black-haired man stared in disbelief before asking if that was really Shin Songyun. The blonde-haired player, equally stunned, exclaimed that Shin Songyun might actually defeat all the orcs, and that he wasn't even joking. With a fierce look in his eyes, Shin Songyun stood before the last remaining orc and declared that it was the last one left, referring to it as the armored orc. The massive orc stepped forward, letting out a deafening growl before swinging its heavy mace at him. The sheer force of the attack sent shockwaves through the ground, leaving cracks and debris in its wake. However, Shin Songyun dodged effortlessly, leaping into the air at the perfect moment. In a single fluid motion, he launched a counterattack, aiming his blade at the orc's neck. Yet, despite his precision, the attack only managed to inflict a shallow wound. Yoon Daekyung, watching intently, shouted in alarm that its skin was too thick and that the attack hadn't worked. As if unfazed, the armored orc retaliated immediately. It swung its massive weapon in reverse, aiming to strike Shin Songyun's neck. The deadly attack closed in just inches away from him when it suddenly stopped. The orc's body froze mid-motion, standing paralyzed and unable to move. Shin Songyun, having anticipated this, smirked and remarked that there was no need to be so dramatic. The massive creature let out a panicked growl, fear evident in its glowing red eyes. It struggled against the unseen force, but its body refused to obey. Just then, a translucent screen appeared, displaying new information. Skill, Demon Bash. Hidden effect, status abnormality. Hindered, cooldown, 50 seconds against the same target. Skill level 1. Effect, hinders a target, either a monster or a human, for 2 seconds. The success rate and duration depended on the target's skill resistance level. A sinister grin spread across Shin Songyun's face as he confirmed that the orc should stay still. Just like that, the armored orc, now fully aware of its predicament, let out a desperate, furious roar. But it was too late. Seizing the moment, Shin Songyun swiftly beheaded the creature. The severed head flew through the air before landing at Yoon Daekyung's feet. Silence filled the dungeon. One of the player team members finally broke it, his voice trembling as he questioned what he had just witnessed. Unable to believe that Shin Songyun had awakened only 3 days ago, another player, staring at the pile of orc corpses, added that the hindrance skill Shin Songyun had used wasn't even ultra-short hindrance. Amidst their shocked conversation, someone else chimed in, wondering aloud if even a named player's best hindrance duration was only 1.5 seconds, and whether Shin Songyun was far too skilled with a great sword. Jokingly, they questioned if they should ask him what kind of YouTube videos he had been watching. Still struggling to process what he had seen, Yoon Daekyung muttered under his breath, questioning whether it had really been hindrance. Against an armored orc, no less. He was baffled that Shin Songyun had awakened only a few days ago and wondered where he had even acquired that skill. Just then, a notification appeared before Shin Songyun. You have leveled up. Another message followed. You have fulfilled the condition for a title. You have been given an F-rank title, Fearless Immature Puppy. A brief description accompanied the title. Title effect, Evasion ×5. Shin Songyun stroked his chin, staring at the screen with an unreadable expression. He admitted that he didn't particularly care about the level up, but found the title somewhat unexpected. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he acknowledged that evasion was actually quite useful. A new system prompt appeared. You have unused bonus stat points. Please choose which stat to raise. Available points, 1. Placing his finger on the screen, he muttered to himself that he already knew which stat he was going to raise. His voice took on a nostalgic tone as he reflected that he had learned this too late in his last life. Without hesitation, he selected luck and increased it by 1. After confirming his choice, he explained aloud that the luck stat was directly related to skill hit rates and artifact drop rates. Though it wasn't exactly necessary for him at the moment, he knew it would be soon. A final system message appeared. Player's luck has increased. Yoon Daekyung walked toward Shin Song-yoon and asked if he was okay. Then, with a confused expression, he hesitated before questioning him further, asking if the skill Shin Song-yoon had just used was hindrance and where he had obtained such an ability. Shin Song-yoon's expression grew slightly uncomfortable as he silently mused that he had merely regressed and was putting his skills to good use, though, of course, he couldn't reveal that. Instead, he kept his response vague, simply stating that he had acquired the skill when he awakened. Yoon Daekyung's brows furrowed in frustration at the answer. He demanded whether Shin Song-yoon truly expected him to believe that. His gaze then shifted toward the long sword in Shin Song-yoon's grasp, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. He warned him not to avoid the question before suggesting that perhaps Shin Song-yoon had just gotten absurdly lucky and obtained a diamond rank artifact. His suspicions deepened as he noticed the faint blue energy radiating from the blade, speculating that it could be something even more powerful. Without hesitation, Shin Song-yoon extended the sword toward him and asked if he wanted to check for himself. Momentarily taken aback by how readily Shin Song-yoon offered his weapon for inspection, Yoon Daekyung took a deep breath to steady himself. He carefully gripped the long sword with both hands and activated the system's appraisal function. A system screen manifested before him. Name: Faded Greatsword. Type: Ordinary Artifact, Two-handed Weapon. Weapon Class: Greatsword. Attack Power: plus 50. Effect: None. A normal greatsword of simple design, without any special abilities. Yoon Daekyung's eyes widened in shock. His voice rose involuntarily as he shouted in disbelief, unable to comprehend that the weapon was truly just a regular greatsword. Shin Song-yoon merely chuckled, his expression calm and knowing as he reminded Yoon Daekyung that he had told him so. Still struggling to process the revelation, Yoon Daekyung pressed further, asking if that meant the skill had truly been Shin Song-yoon's own. A wave of disbelief and frustration washed over him as he muttered to himself that he had been running dungeons for 2 years. Yet even at level 50, he had never obtained a skill as powerful as that. His thoughts trailed off as another concern surfaced, the matter of the party's earnings and how this unexpected development might affect the division of rewards. Before he could dwell on it further, a loud voice suddenly interrupted his thoughts. One of his teammates called out, urgently informing him that the middle boss had risen. Reality sank in. Yoon Daekyung clenched his jaw, feeling a reluctant sense of inferiority creeping in. No matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the truth was undeniable. Shin Song-yoon, despite having awakened only recently, was already surpassing him. Pushing aside his frustration, he quickly refocused and issued orders for his team to prepare for battle. Then, turning back to Shin Song-yoon, he acknowledged that dealing with the minions had been easy thanks to him, but warned him not to overstep. He reminded him that his impressive skill would be of little use against the demon orc they were about to face. Shin Song-yoon merely smiled at the remark, internally reminding himself that this was precisely the reason he had chosen to rejoin this party after regressing. Then, addressing Yoon Daekyung directly, he asked if he would be allowed to claim the artifact should he succeed in defeating the demon orc alone. His smile widened as he pointed out that securing the artifact was the rightful reward for killing it. Yoon Daekyung could only stare at him, stunned by the sheer audacity of his words. After all, the hero had his eyes set on the artifact. He muttered to himself that the Crimson Stone was an artifact that could only be obtained by defeating the demon orcs. Even after slaying hundreds of demon orcs, obtaining the artifact was still considered incredibly difficult. No, the chances of it dropping were extremely low. Recalling his past, the hero murmured that in his past life, after his team had failed to defeat the demon orc, they had been lucky enough to witness another team successfully obtain the Crimson Stone. At that time, the hero had suffered a head injury, blood dripping from the wound as exhaustion clouded his vision. However, his gaze had remained fixed on the team that had managed to acquire the Crimson Stone. Just then, he had overheard someone say that it was one of the only artifacts with the delay skill. That had been the moment the hero had realized that the skill was exactly what he desperately needed. Back in the present, the hero thrust his long sword into the ground and addressed the team leader, stating that if his memory served him right, the party distributed loot based on contribution. If he defeated the monster alone, he assumed there would be no issue. Upon hearing that, Yoon Daekyung's expression darkened. Feeling a bit uneasy, the hero muttered to himself that he needed to obtain the delay skill for future events. However, he was aware that most people would look down on a newbie acting so cocky, and no one would take him seriously. Just then, a black-haired man and a blonde-haired man stormed over, their faces twisted in fury. They shouted in unison, asking if he was crazy. The blonde-haired man stepped forward and demanded to know who he thought he was. The black-haired man glared at him and sneered, questioning whether he really thought he was something just because he had killed a few orcs and daring to talk about item distribution. At that moment, the leader spoke, telling him to do as he pleased. The two men arguing with the hero were left speechless. Yoon Daekyung continued, stating that it would only apply if they failed to defeat the boss. Then, with a cold look, he pointed his finger at the hero and declared that only then would he be able to enter the dungeon alone and kill it himself. He asked if that was understood. Satisfied with the leader's reply, the hero smirked and muttered that it had been easier than he had thought. Then he stated that he would be stepping out of the battle. Yoon Daekyung responded while walking towards the gate leading to the demon orc, telling him to do as he pleased. However, irritation seeped into Yoon Daekyung's expression as he muttered to himself that the cocky guy acted like he was someone special just because he had one broken skill. Placing his hands on the massive door, he began pushing it open, muttering under his breath that he would make sure to clear the dungeon and shut him up. He would show him that experience was what truly mattered on the battlefield. As the door slowly creaked open, he caught a glimpse of the demon orc boss's massive frame. Just then, a notification popped up. You have entered the room of the middle boss. In the grand hall, the boss stood, emanating a menacing purple energy. Chains were wrapped tightly around his entire body. At the center of his chest rested the legendary artifact, the Crimson Stone, secured by 4 thick chains, pulsing with an eerie glow. Just then, a translucent screen flickered into existence, displaying crucial information about the enemy. Middle boss, bloodthirsty demon orc. Yoon Daekyung fixed his gaze on the monstrous figure before him and turned to his team, instructing them to prepare for battle. Though the creature looked intimidating, he reassured himself that, according to the intel he had gathered, it should be an easy win. Raising his voice again, he ordered his team to circle around the boss and attack from the rear. A confident smirk played on his lips as he thought to himself that Shin Song-yoon wouldn't even get the chance to step in. Without hesitation, Yoon Daekyung and his team charged at the boss. Moments later, Yoon Daekyung, now covered in blood, slowly regained consciousness. His vision blurred, his body ached, and confusion clouded his mind. Dazed, he asked what had happened. Watching from the sidelines, Shin Song-yoon let out a disappointed sigh. He had been worried when they rushed in, but he had never expected them to charge head-on so recklessly. Shaking his head, he muttered to himself that this was exactly why they had failed the last time. Meanwhile, one of Yoon Daekyung's blonde-haired teammates rushed to his side, panic evident in his voice as he asked what they should do. Fearing that they would all die if things continued this way. Clenching his fists, Yoon Daekyung stared at the ferocious demon orc, muttering under his breath about how even the high orc before this had been unnaturally strong. He questioned why all these monsters were so powerful and regretted having taken advice from the market. After a brief hesitation, he made his decision and announced to his team that there was no need to defeat the boss that day. They should retreat. However, as he turned to give the order, his eyes landed on Shin Song-yoon's calm and unreadable expression, and a wave of unease washed over him. Still seething with frustration, the blonde-haired man snapped at Shin Song-yoon, demanding to know what was wrong with him. But Yoon Daekyung had no time for arguments. He barked out his orders, telling everyone to retreat, explaining that since the boss had weak peripheral vision, they could escape from the flank. Then, fixing Shin Song-yoon with a sharp glare, He sneered that he had already warned him and told him not to come crying if he ended up dying. Despite the hostility, Shin Songyun simply picked up his long sword, his gaze unwavering. He told them not to worry about him, assuring them that he wouldn't be dying that day. Just then, the demon orc let out a deafening roar and charged at him, gripping its battle axe tightly in both hands before swinging it down with terrifying speed and force. Shin Songyun stood his ground. With focused precision, he grasped his long sword with both hands, a powerful aura radiating from his body. He knew that if they were to compare stats alone, he wouldn't stand a chance. His grip tightened, but with the experience he had gained, he was certain. As the axe came crashing down, he swung his long sword, meeting the demon orc's attack head-on. A sharp clang echoed through the hall as he successfully deflected the devastating blow. Meanwhile, Yoon Daekyung and his team, who had already left the boss room, suddenly heard the clash of weapons echoing from behind. The blonde-haired teammate frowned and asked if he had just heard a clank. Another team member, disbelief evident in his voice, questioned whether Shin Songyun had actually managed to deflect the demon orc's axe. Back inside the boss room, Shin Songyun stood firm, his gaze locked on the towering demon orc. Shaking his stinging hand, he muttered to himself that deflecting the creature's attack was all he could do. His eyes then shifted toward the crimson stone embedded in the demon orc's chest. A flicker of excitement crossed his face as he murmured that it had been a while since he had last seen the artifact. Taking a deep breath, he reflected on his obsession with the stone, knowing its special effect could allow him to combine the delay skill with his own status ability, Demon Bash. He reasoned that Demon Bash already provided a 2-second stun, which was decent. However, with his skill Devour Artifact, he could merge different effects, leading him to a realization: if there existed a way to stack the stun effects of Demon Bash, it could create an infinite stun. A confident smirk formed on his lips as he concluded that obtaining the delay skill would make such a combination possible. Turning his attention back to the enraged demon orc, he taunted it, demanding that it attack him. With a furious roar, the demon orc dashed forward, raising its massive axe high before swinging it down with overwhelming force. Songyun grinned, his eyes narrowing as he observed the creature's movements. He found the attack perfect. It allowed him to analyze its weak spots. At that moment, he moved with incredible speed, slicing through the demon orc and inflicting a severe wound. The massive creature staggered, its axe slipping from its grasp and landing on the ground with a heavy thud. Its body trembled. Songyun had activated Demon Bash the moment its cooldown ended. A notification manifested before him. The demon orc is stunned for 2 seconds. Just then, Yoon Daekyung and his team rushed back into the boss room, their expressions filled with shock. Yoon Daekyung's eyes widened as he stammered in disbelief, realizing that the skill actually worked on middle bosses and exclaiming how overpowered it was. Still smiling, Songyun turned toward the demon orc, remarking that while he had always known orcs to be simple-minded, the creature before him was supposed to be a demon orc. Before he could react, he sensed an attack coming. The demon orc's leg came swinging toward his face at terrifying speed. Acting quickly, he raised his long sword as a makeshift shield, planting it into the ground to absorb the impact. A sharp pain shot through his arms as he gritted his teeth, cursing himself for forgetting about the creature's self-regeneration ability. As the demon orc's wounds began to heal, another notification appeared. The demon orc's self-regeneration ability has lifted the stun effect early. Songyun's expression darkened. He needed 50 more seconds before he could stun it again. That was exactly why he needed the delay skill. Before he could formulate a plan, the demon orc charged at him once more. This time, Songyun didn't move. He stood his ground, waiting. He muttered to himself that if he couldn't stun it, he would simply have to defeat it. As the axe came crashing down again, he deflected the blow and engaged in a fierce clash of steel against steel. Sparks flew as their weapons collided, the sheer force of each strike shaking the room. Watching from the sidelines, Yoon Daekyung observed the battle unfold. One of his teammates rushed over, desperation in his voice as he insisted that they needed to leave immediately, pointing out that even Shin Songyun's skill wasn't working. But Yoon Daekyung barely registered his words. His gaze remained locked on the battle, his mind racing. He struggled to understand how Shin Songyun could fight like that, despite the overwhelming gap in their stats and the failure of his stun skill. Meanwhile, Songyun continued exchanging blows with the demon orc, his movements precise and calculated. The thrill of battle coursed through his veins as he smirked and suggested that they end the fight there. However, as the demon orc pushed him back, he found himself panting. He had been in situations like this before. Then his expression turned serious. He acknowledged to himself that he was too weak. His grip tightened. He needed to focus everything on one point. His mind cleared as he steeled his resolve. Instead of trying to cut the enemy down, he decided he would use its own strength against it. Just then, the demon orc charged toward him with incredible speed. A look of excitement flashed across Songyun's face as he tightened his grip on his long sword. In one swift motion, he stabbed the orc, shattering its axe and driving his blade straight through its heart. A glowing screen panel materialized before him, congratulating him on defeating the middle boss, the demon orc. Immediately following that, another notification appeared, telling him that he had leveled up. A third message soon followed, informing him that he had obtained the E-rank title, Demon Hunter. As the demon orc collapsed to the ground, Songyun checked his progress. A new title description appeared before him, outlining the benefits of the Demon Hunter title. It stated that when facing middle bosses or higher, his health regeneration would increase fivefold. Upon seeing the description, Songyun smirked to himself, noting that he now had two titles. He thought to himself that being a solo player had its perks. Before he could reflect further, movement caught his attention. Yoon Daekyung and his team approached, their faces filled with shock. Yoon Daekyung, in particular, wore a stunned expression, unable to comprehend how Songyun had managed to defeat the demon orc on his own. Songyun exhaled slowly, already anticipating the unnecessary trouble this situation would bring him. With a sly smirk, he murmured to himself that there was one way to avoid a headache like this. At that moment he spoke loudly, his voice carrying across the room. He claimed that he had almost died and wondered what he would have done if their leader hadn't dealt damage to the demon orc. The blonde-haired teammate's face lit up in realization and happily exclaimed that he had known it. He then turned to Yoon Daekyung and asked when he had managed to hit the demon orc. Yoon Daekyung, still slightly confused, remained silent, not answering his teammate's question. Instead, he focused on Songyun, narrowing his eyes and asking what he meant by that. Songyun didn't respond. He simply stood there, silent. Muttering to himself, he thought that Yoon Daekyung couldn't possibly be that stupid and that he was giving him a chance to preserve his honor. Understanding Songyun's unspoken intention, Yoon Daekyung let out a quiet sigh. He murmured under his breath, realizing that Songyun was suggesting he should keep his promise. Felt like his complete defeat. After a brief pause, Yoon Daekyung straightened up and addressed his team. He told them to pay attention and mentioned that now that they had defeated the middle boss, they needed to prepare for the final boss. With that, the group gathered themselves and set off toward their next challenge. As they left, Songyun's attention shifted back to the Crimson Stone. A satisfied smile crossed his face as he reached out toward it, thinking to himself that it was time to try eating it up. At that moment, another screen appeared before him, displaying information about the artifact. It listed the Crimson Stone as a silver accessory with the special effect of delay, bonus stats of +10 health and +10 strength, and a description noting that it was a rare item obtained by defeating the demon orc, representing strength, tenacity, and endurance. Using his skills, Shin Songyun delved into the depths of his unconsciousness. As his awareness settled, his eyes widened in surprise when he saw an unfamiliar dish before him. A screen flickered to life, displaying the words, Master Chef's Bibim Naengmyeon with meat jelly. Realizing he could make himself comfortable, he conjured a table and chair within his subconscious. Just as he prepared to enjoy his meal, another notification appeared, informing him that he was ready to absorb Crimson Stone. Wasting no time, he picked up his chopsticks, grabbed some meat and noodles and began eating. Almost immediately, a system panel appeared, confirming that the absorption of Crimson Stone was in progress. Another screen soon followed, stating that, according to the 20% base stat absorption rate of Silver rank, both his strength and health stats had increased by +2. A third notification revealed that he had gained a special effect called Delay, and a final system panel announced that he could now apply this effect to his skills. A wave of nervousness washed over him as he muttered to himself, wondering why this process was making him uneasy. After a brief hesitation, he instructed the system to bind the Delay skill to Demon Bash. A notification confirmed the successful merge, stating that the effect of Delay had been added to Demon Bash. Another screen expanded with further details, explaining that if he used Demon Bash before the first stun state ended, he could guarantee an extension into a second stun state. The probability of extending it further decreased with each consecutive use. 90% for the third, 60% for the fourth, and 30% for the fifth. As he regained consciousness, he exhaled, deep in thought. A guaranteed for second stun, he hadn't expected it to actually work. Studying the system panel, he murmured to himself that he had only theorized it was possible, but now he knew it could be done. At that moment, Yoon Daekyung approached and asked if they could talk. Songyun turned toward him and nodded, prompting Daekyung to explain that they were now standing in front of the final boss room, the Orc Berserker. Before Daekyung could continue, Songyun interrupted, asking if he was expected to join in later. With a smile, Daekyung extended his hand and admitted that it would be a failure as a leader if he didn't make use of a member like Songyun. He then suggested that they work together. Songyun shook his hand but reminded him that his conditions remained unchanged. Daekyung sighed and agreed. Just then, a blonde-haired teammate approached, reporting that they were ready to enter the boss room. Daekyung nodded and gave the order to proceed, turning to the team and urging them to stay on guard. As they prepared to move out, Songyun noticed the blonde-haired teammate glaring at him with resentment. Puzzled by the hostility, he muttered to himself, questioning whether he had imagined it. Moments later, they entered the final boss room. At the center of the vast arena, the Orc Berserker stood, gripping two massive weapons. A red aura pulsed around its body as it let out a guttural growl. A system notification appeared, confirming the final boss, Orc Berserker. At the sight of the monster's ominous aura, Daekyung exhaled, his expression helpless. Turning to Songyun, he stated that he would go in first. However, Songyun gripped his long sword and told him to stick with him instead. Daekyung hesitated, trying to convince him otherwise, but Songyun ignored him. Taking a deep breath, he reminded himself that Orc Berserkers had lower skill resistance compared to Demon Orcs, making them easier to stun. If he remained calm and attacked strategically, he was confident he wouldn't have any problems. With that thought in mind, he stepped forward, ready for battle. At that moment, Shin Songyun dashed toward the Orc Berserker. Letting out a deafening growl, the boss monster charged at him as well, swinging its weapons with lethal force. As their clash grew closer, a thought crossed Songyun's mind. He recalled the words he had spoken just moments ago, telling the others to stick with him. He wondered if he had ever spoken with such confidence before. Memories from his past surfaced. When he was younger, he had always relied on others to carry him. As he grew older, he had only struggled to survive. He resolved that he could not live that kind of life again. Back in the present, our hero deflected the Orc Berserker's attack with his longsword. However, the monster did not relent, swinging its heavy mace with overwhelming power. With unwavering determination, Songyun met the relentless assault head-on. His eyes burned with confidence as he muttered to himself that he needed to change his weak past and shape his future. To do that, he had to prove his overwhelming abilities to everyone watching. Observing the fierce battle, Yoon Daekyung was stunned. Witnessing the sheer force behind Songyun's attacks, he could not help but exclaim in disbelief, calling him a monster. At that moment, Songyun landed a decisive strike, slicing deep into the orc berserker's chest. Wasting no time, he dashed forward and shouted to the team that the boss would be stunned for 4 seconds. A system notification appeared. Skill: Demon Bash, Level 1, has been activated. Hearing Song Yoon's warning, Yoon Daekyung immediately commanded his team to move in and finish the boss off. Seizing the opportunity, the players rushed forward. As they closed in, they unleashed a flurry of attacks, cutting into the boss's body from every direction. With their combined efforts, the orc berserker let out a final roar before collapsing lifelessly onto the ground. A system notification popped up. Congratulations! You have defeated the final boss, Orc Berserker. Another one followed. Congratulations! You have cleared the dungeon, Altar of the Crimson Orc. As the Orc Berserker's massive body lay motionless, one of the players scoffed, remarking that the dungeon had been surprisingly easy and that he had not even needed to use a potion. The player beside him agreed, pointing out how powerful the stun effect was and how it had made the fight effortless. Meanwhile, the Porter team had their eyes fixed on Song-yoon. Their leader turned to his team members and asked if they thought he had a personal porter yet, wondering if he should approach him. The man beside him smirked, saying that he had been planning to ask first. Noticing their sudden shift in attitude, Song-yoon let out a sarcastic chuckle, quietly remarking to himself how quickly their stance had changed. He had no intention of doing anything for them. Just then, a new system notification appeared. You have leveled up. Another message followed. You have obtained the D-rank title, with overwhelming power. At that moment, a surge of energy coursed through Song-yoon's body. A system panel materialized, displaying his new title with overwhelming power. Rank, D-rank. Effect: the duration of your status effects lasts 10% longer. A bright smile spread across his face as he stared at the screen. He muttered that it was a true harvest of titles, something he had never managed to obtain in his previous life. But then his expression darkened slightly. He acknowledged to himself that it was still nothing compared to a certain man. Recalling the person in his thoughts, he spoke the name aloud. Ghostblade, Du Gyungsu. Titles: the Collector, the Complete Sword. Du Gyungsu, the strongest swordsman player in Korea. A man who had acquired countless titles. Just 2 years after the Age of Players had begun, he had already surpassed level 500. Before Song-yoon's regression, Gyungsu had been someone he had only admired from afar. But now things were different. With determination burning in his eyes, Song-yoon clenched his fists, convinced that there was no reason he could not catch up to him. Shin Song-yoon steeled himself, determined to reach his goal. He muttered under his breath that he might have a chance if he stepped into the fire from that moment on. Just then, Yoon Daekyung approached him and asked what he was doing. Caught off guard, Song-yoon hesitated before replying with an embarrassed look that he had just been stretching. Seemingly uninterested in his excuse, Yoon Daekyung held out an artifact, the one that had dropped from the Orc Berserker, and handed it to him, stating that he had done a great job and should take it. Song-yoon's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't expected this. As he accepted the gift, he asked suspiciously what had gotten into Daekyung. With a faint smile, Yoon Daekyung shrugged and told him that he had really carried the team this time and that, contrary to what some might believe, he did have a sense of morality. Then, with a proud look, he added that it was just a bronze rank artifact, so he could afford to be generous. Song-yoon smirked and remarked that Daekyung was a little too honest. Chuckling, Yoon Daekyung admitted that he wouldn't have given it to him if it had been expensive. Then, lowering his voice, he muttered to himself that he was only giving it away because they wouldn't be seeing each other again anyway. It hurt to admit it, but even he had to acknowledge that Song-yoon was already living in a different world from them. Meanwhile, watching from behind, one of the party members, a blonde-haired man, gritted his teeth in frustration. His hands clenched into fists as he muttered under his breath that Daekyung was favoring that guy just because he had shown off his skills a few times. He seethed at the unfairness of it, questioning why he, who had served Daekyung for so long, was being treated differently. Fueled by jealousy, he pulled out his phone, dialing a number as he whispered darkly, that he would make sure Songyun died along with someone else. Later, at Songyun's apartment in Songpa district, our hero couldn't hide his happiness. Holding his phone, he stared at his bank account balance and grinned, thinking that this was exactly why he was a player. Porters barely made $200 a day. Noting that Yoon Dae-kyung had transferred 6 million won, Songyun raised an eyebrow, realizing that Dae-kyung had given him more than double what the others had received. His gaze shifted to the artifact resting on the table, and he smirked, remarking that it was a nice bonus on top of everything else. A system notification appeared before him. Item information. Name, Berserker Ring. Rank, Bronze Artifact. Equipment type, Ring. Special effect, Lighten. Effect, Strength plus 10. Description. A ring that can only be obtained from orc berserkers. It enhances the blood rage of the wearer. Songyun's smile widened as he noted that even though it was just a bronze rank artifact, he hadn't expected to get one with a lighten effect for free. Another screen materialized in front of him. Special effect, Lighten. Effect description. Consumes 1 mana per second to reduce the weight of all equipped artifacts to 1 gram. Studying the description, he frowned slightly, realizing why it was only a bronze rank item. Most players would run out of mana before they even got a chance to swing their sword. Then, his lips curled into a confident grin as he told himself that this might be true for most players, but not for him. As Shin Songyun recalled his past, he reflected on how he had only discovered his ability after 50 years. That was precisely why he had studied it so relentlessly. In his previous life, he had also devoured an artifact that required mana, but the results had been shocking. He had learned that artifacts with special effects dependent on mana did receive a penalty, yet in exchange they lost their mana cost entirely. Determined to test his ability, Songyun activated Devour on the Berserker Ring. At that moment, a system notification appeared before him, beginning mana synchronization with Berserker Ring. His eyes lit up with excitement as he thought to himself that it didn't matter if there was a penalty. More skills were always better. Meanwhile, at a high-end private club in Seoul, a blonde-haired man slammed his drink down in frustration, his voice rising as he insisted to the man across from him that he wasn't lying. The guy they were talking about had really pulled off a 4-second stun. The man he was speaking to, a towering figure with a cold glare, narrowed his eyes and asked if he was raising his voice. Realizing his mistake, the blonde-haired man immediately tensed. He swallowed hard and quickly apologized. The huge man scoffed, looking down at him with disdain before asking if he expected him to get revenge. Desperate to convince him, the blonde-haired man leaned in, explaining that the target was definitely loaded. He must have been using some kind of stun-related artifact. The gang leader, unimpressed, sneered and demanded to know what exactly he was expected to do about it. Clenching his fists, the blonde-haired man insisted that this wasn't just about revenge. He was talking business. He pointed out that Yoon Dae-kyung favored the target, making him a valuable mark. At this, the leader's expression shifted slightly. He mused that, in the end, the blonde-haired man did want revenge after all. Nearby, a blonde-haired woman leaned toward the man beside her and scoffed, questioning whether he was actually close to the target. She remarked that the guy looked like a complete loser. Before the blonde-haired man could respond, a man with an injured eye suddenly stepped forward. Without hesitation, he sliced off the blonde-haired man's right ear with a blade. A piercing scream rang out through the club. As the injured man writhed in agony, clutching the side of his head, the man with the injured eye slowly walked toward him, a wicked grin stretching across his face. He sneered as he asked if the man actually thought of them as his personal servants. Reaching for a cup of wine from the table, he poured it over the bleeding wound, watching in amusement as the blonde-haired man howled in pain. Then, in a cold tone, he told him that if he wanted their attention, he had better be prepared to pay the price. His expression darkened further as he crouched down beside his victim and added that he would listen, but only for as much as his ear had been worth. Finally, his voice dropping into a chilling whisper, he demanded to know where the so-called loser was.